Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the show today. I am Nifemi Oguntoye. Thousands of kilometers away from Nigeria, bombs are falling in the Middle East, and yet the shock waves are being felt right here at our petrol stations. In just a matter of days, the escalating conflict involving the U.S., Israel, and Iran sent global crude oil prices soaring above $100 per barrel, briefly touching nearly $120, the highest level since 2022. Amid fears that the war could disrupt oil supply routes through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical energy corridors. That panic in the global market quickly translated into rising fuel prices across many countries, including Nigeria, where petrol is now selling above 1,300 naira per litre in some locations, putting fresh pressure on households already battling high food and transport costs. And this raises a critical national question. For millions of Nigerians, the consequences are immediate. Petrol powers transportation across the country. Diesel keeps businesses running in a nation where many companies rely on generators because of unstable electricity supply. As a matter of fact, the power supply these days, I can't tell where it is. I woke up one night and I was sweating all over. Fuel prices now increasing, transport fares climbing, food prices increasing, the cost of doing business might also shoot up. There are also concerns this new fuel shock could reverse the modest gains Nigeria has made in slowing inflation, especially if energy costs continue to climb. Now, there may be a glimmer of relief. Global oil prices fell sharply today, with Brent crude dropping to around $90 per barrel after diplomatic signals suggested the conflict in the Middle East might soon de-escalate. But the big question remains, will Nigerians feel that relief at the pump? Or are we trapped in a system where global shocks will always translate into higher fuel prices at home? Tonight, we examine the economic implications, the policy options, and what relief, if any, Nigerians can realistically expect beyond just the numbers. Let's go beyond the headlines. From our Lagos studio, I'm joined by Ayodele Adio, communication expert and public affairs analyst. From Abuja, Olabode Shomi, energy expert. Gentlemen, welcome to the program, and thank you for joining us. Mr. Adio, thank you for joining us again.
Thank you for having me. It's good to be here.
Let me begin with Mr. Shomi in Abuja. Nigeria is Africa's largest crude oil producer. With Dangote Refinery now operating, many expected fuel prices to become more stable. Help us understand the mechanics. Why is Nigeria still so vulnerable to global oil shocks?
Okay, thank you for having me. I think first and fundamentally, crude oil is a commodity. And like any other commodity, be it cotton, be it gold, it follows the same dynamics and the same principles. It is fungible, it is universal in pricing, etc., etc. So in simple terms, the price of crude oil is not really determined by us. It's determined by a dynamics of supply and demand across a global network. And the issues around the Strait of Hormuz, the issues in the Middle East, is significant because close to 40% of global trade takes place around there. If the supply chain is disrupted or interrupted for whatever reason, it is just simple economics that there is less supply and, of course, more demand. That is at the root of the price increase in crude oil. Now, when you bring it home, in terms of refining, close to 65 to 70% of the final cost of your finished product, be it diesel, be it petrol, comes from crude oil. So if crude oil prices are affected, it is just normal that the final product price will be affected. However, there is a big but, the Dangote that you mentioned. It is my understanding that the Dangote enjoys the crude for Naira. What has not been made clear in terms of what some people are saying is that the crude for Naira contract that was signed was at a fixed price. In other words, it was done at a price that, irrespective of the shocks in the system, they will continue to produce at that. If that were to be the case, then there will not be a reason for price increase. But because there is price increase, it is my understanding, or it is my logical conclusion, that they are probably operating crude for Naira at the prevailing US dollar rate. But those are some of the dynamics that needs to be looked into to determine what is really happening and why we are where we are.
Let me bring Mr. Adio into this conversation. The Dangote Refinery was expected to reduce our exposure to imported fuel. From what we're seeing today, has that expectation been overstated?
I wouldn't argue that it's been overstated. In terms of objective, I would argue that it's meeting that critical objective of limiting your exposure to imported petrol, right? Because the amount of petrol being imported into the country has reduced significantly as Dangote has ramped up production locally. And that's always good for energy security. Of course, it's good for forex exposure. And of course, it creates jobs locally. So to that extent, I think it has meets that critical objective. But obviously, the question has always been about the pricing as having been endured by Nigerians over the last couple of days, and the volatility in pricing that has pushed it upwards. And like, Mr. Olabode earlier explained, the reason for the increase in prices is not because a business simply just wants to raise the cost. It's largely because the cost of crude has gone up internationally, and that has to be reflected, at the pumps.
So in short, even though Nigeria produces crude oil and refines more of it locally today, global oil shocks still translate quickly into higher petrol prices at home. Mr. Showumi, Nigerians effectively now pay global prices for locally produced fuel. Isn't that a problem?
I'm not sure why it is a problem. I think it's more of an understanding issue. It's also an understanding issue in terms of the expectations from the refineries themselves. So to begin with, I've explained before, crude oil is an international commodity. There is not much we can do as a local player as a local producer to determine the international pricing of crude. What is possible is that we can produce crude and sell it at whatever we want to sell it for the local market, which is a kind of subsidy, and which we now go back to the fundamentals of how the current government is choosing to do their economics. Do they want to play in subsidy? Do they want to do partial subsidy? That's a total different discussion. That is not an energy discussion. So if you look at it, we also produce cocoa, but there is not much the farmer here can do to determine the global price of cocoa. They can determine how much you sell cocoa between farmers, between Osun State and maybe Uyo, but they cannot determine international price. So what is possible is that maybe the refineries that are existing, they can sell to them at whatever price the budget was benchmarked upon. That is a possible discussion. But there's a quid pro quo. So there must be something the government will get. So the government too has to have some negotiations with the refiners and all that. So in simple terms, there must be honest, frank, direct conversations between government, between the refiners and the marketers who form the third-party outlet. It is in the honesty of that discussion that Nigerians can have respite.
So we are paying attention to what's also happening globally. Governments are already stepping in to cushion the shock from the Middle East crisis. South Korea, for instance, announced a domestic fuel price cap for the first time in nearly 30 years. Indonesia is increasing fuel subsidies. Vietnam is also now taking out fuel import tariffs to stabilize supply and prices. Let me talk to Mr. Adio. I read your article where you're asking government to introduce temporary subsidy. I'm wondering what you're thinking, because the Tinubu government actually removed it.
Why is that a difficult conversation to have? Because we constantly are pushing the burden, most oftentimes, of government incompetence and negligence to poor people to bear the brunt, and it makes no sense to me. You've just, started this conversation with global examples. South Korea has put a cap on prices on petrol, first time in 30 years. That's a country whose per capita income is 15 times larger than that of Nigeria's. Vietnam has followed suit. In fact, Thailand has put a cap on energy prices over the next 15 days. All of these are countries who have purchasing incomes that are 10 times that of Nigeria's at the moment, which is less than $1,000. So we can't be drowned by this neoliberal psychophancy to say that Nigerians who are already dealing with huge cost of living crisis should continue to absorb more and more energy costs that's become, quite frankly, unbearable.
My point really is that would a temporary intervention not undermine those reforms, that started just a couple of years ago?
Reforms are not an end in itself. Reforms are supposed to lead you to an end. And that end, I believe, is improved standard of living for the average Nigerian. And the fact that we tout this reform as if it's an end in itself is just the gateway, right, to guarantee improved living conditions for the average Nigerian. And at this particular moment, businesses are groaning. You can't run your business effectively if diesel is hovering at 100,000 or at 1,400 to 1,600 naira per liter. It makes no sense. It's going to raise cost of production. It will force, people to lay off workers, because you really and truly cannot deal with that high cost structure. So the sensible thing to do, because it's also a short-term measure, is to put relative caps on these prices and ensure that there's a bit of stability so that businesses can continue to operate, so that transportation costs will not, experience huge spikes.
Short term will be counting on the fact that this war is going to end anytime soon. You saw the market reacting to Trump's position, but the next minute he's saying, "I'm going to rain fire on you if you stop oil passing through the strait." So how long are we going to intervene for?
Again, I always like to go back to the drawing board. The security of citizens has to be the number one priority of government. And I've argued earlier that no citizenry can manage energy cost of 1,400 naira per liter for petrol and over 1,600 naira for diesel. So some sort of subsidy has to come in, especially when the government voted about $250 million as it claimed when it was launching its ambitious CNG programs. Nifemi, I'd like to ask you, where are the buses? So you've spent, or purportedly claimed to have raised, about $250 million for a CNG project that was supposed to save this country $2 trillion every month, and we cannot see a single powered CNG bus in Lagos State.
You can't see anyone at all.
Have you seen one?
I saw one the other day.
Come on.
I actually saw
the
one.
Intervention.
But I don't see them often.
Exactly.
I agree with you to that.
So the intervention, which was supposed to deal with mass public transportation, to cushion the effect of transportation, has not materialized. So in other words, you ask the question, where has the savings from the petrol subsidy gone? Where has the investment, the public investment in mass public transportation and mass public housing that is supposed to reduce the burden on citizens? It is completely non-existent. And we keep making these excuses every time that people should deal with this temporary pain. Whereas when it comes to the rich and the wealthy, AMCON and CBN has spent over 3 trillion saving banks from bad loans over the last decade. But when it comes to the average man, we keep telling him to bear the brunt and pray harder to his God.
The politician in you is coming out right now. I can feel it. Mr. Showme, let me get your thoughts on this subsidy suggestion. Are there realistically any policy tool the Nigerian government can deploy right now, or you think it has to be temporary subsidy?
Okay, so first of all, I'm not an economist. That must be said. I speak to my areas of competence. I'm an energy person. And yeah, I did some financial economics in the University of London, but it's just 1 or 2 courses. The thing about subsidy is that subsidy is a cost. So it's not like a wish. And that subsidy cost has to come from somewhere. Why that needs to be kept in perspective is that we have run subsidy for a number of years that resulted in the situation just under 2 years ago where we could not pay the airlines for the tickets that were being bought. If you recall, there were a few airlines like Emirates that are withdrawn flying from Nigeria, primarily because there was no funds. There was even threats that in a few months, the nation will not be able to pay civil servant salaries. So there are implications to some of these things. I am not in government, neither do I know the dynamics of government. I'm just speaking to the situation where we were as a result of many years of subsidy. So whether that is what is going to be avoided by avoiding another subsidy reign, or as Mr. Adio has said, whether there's a need for a temporary subsidy move, is a judgment call, and it's a judgment call for those who are in leadership to do it. What we would expect as citizens is that they will act in character, they will act in integrity, and do what is best for the citizens. But whether we should do a temporary subsidy regime or we should not is a decision that the person who has the holistic view should be able to make, and who is in the best place to make. At this stage, I'm not able to advise on that.
But he has to make the best decision for Nigeria at this time. One thing is certain, we're exposed to the full volatility of the global oil market. My producer called me this morning and we're talking about this topic. And they mentioned that fuel is now 1,250. I said, no, it's 1,080 naira. Because that was what I bought it yesterday. Back to the filling station today, it's increased. And I'm hearing that some people are buying it as much as more than 1,300 naira. Now, I understand your point of view, Mr. Adio, but oil prices have also, we hear today, has fallen to around $90 per barrel. How quickly could Nigerians realistically see relief at the pump? Because here they say when prices go up, they hardly return. Mr. Adio, what do you think?
Well, to be honest with you, before we came into the studio, I think I read a news story that Dangote has dropped prices by about 100 naira.
Yeah.
Right? So clearly we're beginning to see that, you know, the local refiner has dropped prices by 100 naira. I'm sure that other marketers will follow suit in the next couple of days. But the truth is we're still in very volatile times. This drop in prices you're seeing was largely triggered after a press conference that President Trump gave, where he was saying that they had achieved the objective of the war and things have stabilized, and the markets reacted to that largely. We don't know what will happen in the next couple of days, but I can say that we must brace for impact because the situation in the Middle East is still largely fluid. You're still likely to see a lot of disruptions and a lot of volatility is still likely to follow. And we must pay attention to this volatility. All I'm arguing is that while this volatility exists, it's important that the Nigerian government at the federal level and perhaps even at the state level should also prepare to shield its citizens from the extreme or the extremism of high energy prices so that it doesn't reverse some of the modest gains that it claims to have made over the last couple of months, and so that it doesn't plunge people into more difficulty than they are already carrying at the very moment. I mean, people are already used to paying for petrol at an average of 800 naira per litre. So in real terms, what you'll be subsidizing will be about 200-300 naira per litre. And this time around, you have a Dangote Refinery where you can have an efficient subsidy regime, as was the case in those days where marketers just came and quoted whatever they wanted to, and you paid even people without even bringing products into the country. So you're going to likely have a more realistic, watertight approach to a subsidy system, largely because it's temporary and because you have an efficient local refinery backdoor that can make you have, quite frankly, a transparent program. But at the heart of my argument is that we cannot afford to plunge our people into the deep ends of the water, especially when countries that are much richer than us are already stepping in to provide some sort of cushion for their citizens.
I know that it's pre-election year. Government is also likely going to be under a lot of pressure to ensure that Nigerians aren't feeling the bite of the price hike. But my concern, Mr. Showmi, really is the big question of how Nigerians are directly impacted. You have mentioned that it's a global reality. Is there no way we can shield an oil-producing nation like Nigeria from the volatility of the global oil prices?
I think sometimes we overestimate some of these planning, foresight things. So let me give you an example. How does an airline protect a plane that is crashing? I mean, the plane is dropping in the air. I mean, you can make some preparation before ground for an air crash. You can do compensation after the air crash. But what do you do when the plane is crashing? So what is happening today is what is called a force majeure. And we are not the most, I mean, for example, if I had a $20 million business in Iran, Who is going to enforce the contracts today? If it involves pipelines and those pipelines have been blown, what are we protecting? Even if that were the major income for a whole state, I mean, there are LNG terminals in Qatar that has been bombed, and those things are going to be shut down. And it's not like they can be opened immediately. There's a ceasefire. There's a process, and it will take time for it to be. So these things do happen. It is important to note that they are force majeure, and there's really not much anybody can do about that. That is first to note. Number two is that we also have to be careful the options we are giving for solutions, even if we consider it temporary. And we have a lot of history to prove to that. The first time in Nigeria that fuel was imported was during the 1993 crisis because of Pengasson strike. But it was that trial at importing fuel that led to the appetite of people seeing free money to be made, that led to people sabotaging the refineries, that led us to where we are now. So if we had resisted the urge to import fuel in 1993, we won't have the case of what we have now. So whether it is introduction of subsidy, whether it is using a particular refinery for it, we need to consider the implications both on the short term and on the long term. In terms of policies that are best, in terms of whether subsidy is the best, I keep saying I'm not an economist. The CBN people are there, the government policy people are there. They should look into the thing and decide what is best for us. But it is important that we don't start what we cannot finish.
Mr. Adio, you have also mentioned that you have warned that rising petrol and diesel prices could trigger a chain reaction across the economy. Help us understand the scale of that risk. How quickly can higher fuel price now translate into higher food prices and what have you?
Well, I mean, it depends on how sustained those higher prices are, right? And that's quite frankly the argument I was trying to make, that if this is likely to be sustained, it will have a cataclysmic effect down the chain. It means transportation cost is going to go up. That means the cost of you going to work and back home is going to almost double. It means the prices of food is likely going to go up. It means, landlords are going to raise rents, as they have consistently done over the past 2 years in Lagos particularly. So, before I came into the studio, I was just even watching a video by the actor and producer Kunle Afolayan, who was complaining about how he's been struggling over the last 3 days to power on his studio and his resort because of high energy prices that he's having to incur. So it's going to have a huge cataclysmic effect down the chain. And if not well managed, we'll be back to the ugly days when the petrol subsidy was just removed, where many gains, the purchasing power of millions of Nigerians was completely eroded, where millions more were thrown into abject poverty. We just cannot afford to go back to those days, especially when we're beginning to experience some sort of growth, however minute. But, we can't just afford to reverse those gains very quickly. So for me, I think it's just a sensible thing to do, to protect as many citizens as we can protect, and provide the guardrails to ensure that those protection schemes are not exploited by the scavengers at the corridors of power. And if they do, you would have to hold yourself to blame, because you're supposed to ensure that your schemes are watertight and waterproof and they achieve the objectives for which they were set out to in the very first instance.
Mr. Showme, we have to go now. In 30 seconds, if you can, what does this tell us about how quick a transition we are making from fuel to other energy alternatives?
I think we need to look at our own reality, and rather than doing a Me Too energy security approach to things, we must understand that even in those nations, most of transportation is still, in terms of percentage, still largely dependent on fossil fuels. So rather than trying to copy others, we need to look at our own reality. Our own reality speaks to petrol, speaks to diesel, speaks to CNG. Let us stick to what works, make the best out of it. Then after that, we can look at the sexy options. But for now, let's stick to what works for us.
Good place to live it, gentlemen. Across the world, governments are already stepping in to cushion the shock from the Middle East crisis. We talked about South Korea earlier announcing a domestic fuel price cap for the first time in nearly 30 years to shield its economy from rising energy costs. Other countries are also moving. Indonesia is increasing fuel subsidies, while Vietnam is temporarily eliminating fuel import tariffs to stabilize supply and prices. The big question here for the Nigerian government would be, are we going to consider temporary stabilization measures like Mr. Adio mentioned, targeted subsidies and what have you? I guess we'll wait to see the decision that the Tinubu government will make in this regard. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining this conversation. Ayodele Adio, communication expert and public affairs analyst, is also a politician. He has just joined the ADC. So finally, I have broken the news, right? Thank you so much for joining us. Mr. Olabode Showumi, energy expert, live from our studio in Abuja. Glad to have you join us as well.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Remember, you can watch it again at midnight and 6 a.m. tomorrow. I am Nifemi Oguntoye.